Welcome, brave souls. To the chilling depths of Mrs. Devil's Tales, we delve into the spine-chilling world of cryptids horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. I will never stop at a highway rest area ever again. I recently landed a position in sales with a very solid company in the medical device industry. Being in my mid-20s, I am thrilled to work for such an innovative company. The money is great, the job is fun, and hell, they even gave me a company vehicle. That's a great perk. The only downside to the job is that my sales territory is quite expansive and covers several states, and because of budget constraints, they expect me to drive to most of my customers. I could not complain, however. Not many people my age get these kinds of opportunities. I finished up my workday at a hospital in central Pennsylvania when I received a phone call from a clinic in western New York that wanted to place a buy for my products. But before they could do so, they wanted a product demo. Not wanting to lose the opportunity, I agreed to be there by 9 a.m. My GPS showed the trip to be 5 hours if I took a highway that cut through the Allegheny forest. Being that it was now 5 p.m., I figured that I could make the drive now since I had a bag packed with extra scrubs, toiletries, and product manuals for my current trip. I headed to a gas station, filled my SUV, purchased some snacks and 2 energy drinks, and hopped on the single-lane highway north towards New York State. It was the middle of November and quite cold, with the sun setting early and giving way to darkness in the late afternoon. By the time I had started my drive, it was already dark. Thick clouds were obscuring the moonlight. A wall of trees surrounded my vehicle on both sides, making it seem that I was driving my SUV through a tunnel of wood and darkness. The headlights from my vehicle illuminating the staggered white lines separating the lanes of the highway were the only source of light. The drive definitely took on an ominous feel. I thought nothing of it as I slugged back my energy drinks and listened to some comedy podcasts to pass the time. When I was about 2 hours into my drive, the inevitable happened when one has had large amounts of caffeine and a belly full of gas station snacks. I had to find a restroom eventually, which I was okay with since I wanted to get out of the car and stretch my legs anyway. I had passed a small town about 15 minutes back and I knew that I would need to find another one and pull off the highway or see if there was a rest stop anywhere ahead. Almost as if fate had heard me beckoning, I saw a sign that said, "Rest Area 2 miles." This is my lucky night, I thought as I realized that I would not have to resort to relieving myself in the middle of the woods on a dark and creepy night. I came upon the rest area, which was located right off of the side of the highway. It was nothing like the rest areas one is used to encountering on major highways. There were no restaurants or vending machines. There was a single, lonely picnic table and a garbage can on a patch of grass and 2 separate brick buildings with brown metal roofs on them. A single overhead street lamp barely illuminated my oasis as it was flickering on and off, probably from neglect considering how remote this place was and how little use it was getting. The building to the left housed the ladies' restrooms, while the one to my right housed the men's restrooms. I placed my car in park in one of the 10 available spots in front of the buildings and grabbed my phone to keep me entertained while I took care of business. As I walked on the narrow concrete walkway towards the restrooms, I caught a glimpse of something in the woods behind the rest area. It was still quite dark outside, and the overhead light provided too little illumination to discern what I was looking at. All I could see at that distance was an obscure black shape shifting through the thick trees. It could have simply been my eyes playing tricks on me since I had spent the better part of the day either in a brightly lit operating room or driving down a pitch-black highway. I shrugged my shoulders and made my way into the men's room. There were 3 stalls at the far end of the restroom flanking 3 urinals. 2 flimsy overhead lights with exposed bulbs were the only sources of light. One of the panels had a bulb completely out and the other was flickering sporadically, making the entire room look like it was lit by strobe lights in a nightclub. Just perfect, I thought. I'm stuck in the creepiest bathroom in the world and I can barely see anything. I decided not to make a big deal about it. I'd be back on the road shortly. I took the stall in the middle. I had no reason why. I'd simply just randomly selected it. I sat down and nearly jumped from how cold the seat was. This was becoming quite an annoyance. At that moment, I had no idea, but things were about to get a whole hell of a lot worse. As I was in the midst of doing my business, the lights went out. Of all the times that this pathetic, single tubular bulb could have called it quits, it had to do so when I was using a restroom in one of the most isolated spots in the state. "You've got to be ****king kidding me," I groaned out loud. At this point, the light from my phone was the only source of light cutting through the shroud of darkness that crept over the entire room. It was only at this point that I realized how quiet it had been this entire time. Aside from sound of the slight breeze outside hitting the building, it was dead silent. I sat there in silence, playing games on my phone when I first heard it. At first, it sounded like a faint shuffling sound, the obscure noise of someone, or something, making its way towards the entrance of the restroom. I found this rather odd because I would have heard another vehicle pull up since the parking lot was right across from the two buildings. The shuffling then became more discernible. It was footsteps. Slow, trudging footsteps were making their way into the restroom. By how loud they were, whoever or whatever this was had entered the room. As the footsteps continued, I noticed that they were making a slapping sound against the tile floor. It was as if this person, or thing, was barefoot. The footsteps became heavier and louder, and I noticed that they were moving towards the stalls. I locked my phone screen and sat there frozen with fear. My heart was pounding out of my chest, and sweat started to creep across my brow despite the chill in the air. By this point, along with the heavy, slapping footsteps, I heard the breathing. This thing's breathing was too otherworldly to be human. It took long, heavy, animal-like breaths and exhaled in a way that resembled an asthmatic with a faint whistle at the end. I had never heard such a thing. By this point, my bowels were completely voided from fear, and I was grateful that I had been sitting on a toilet, for I would have ****t my pants had I not been. This foreboding presence continued to trudge towards me until I heard its heavy breaths right outside the door to the stall. In the pitch-black restroom, all I could hear was this thing breathing a mere few feet away from me, now certain that it was aware of my presence. My heart continued to pound as I heard it shuffle around outside of the stall. I had never felt so helpless in my life. I was trapped here at the mercy of this creature. After what I imagine was several minutes, the breathing quieted down some. I had pulled my feet up and I was squatted on the toilet in fear of this thing seeing me. I knew that it was still there, but for whatever reason, call it curiosity or perhaps a fear-induced lack of judgment, I took out my phone and flicked up the flashlight app and pointed it at the floor underneath the stall door entrance. I nearly dropped my phone in horror at what I saw. 2 massive feet were pointed straight at me. They were unbelievable large, too large to be human. The tops of them were covered with a matted brown and gray hair, while the toes were a pale purplish-colored flesh with toenails that were long, ragged, and yellow. I barely had time to notice the grotesque feet of this creature when it took notice of the light and let out a monstrous growl that shattered the silence of the pitch-black room. It sounded like a growl that came straight from hell. It was a primal, guttural, inhuman voice. The noise was deafening. My terror had completely overtaken me as I fell onto the floor and prepared to meet my doom at the hands of this beast. I closed my eyes as I heard it begin to pound on the door. cracking noises indicating that it was getting closer on every strike to breaking the stall open and getting its probably equally grotesque hands on me. Just when I thought that I was a dead man, the monster had quieted down and ceased its assault on the stall door. I opened my eyes. I was still alive for now. It was then that I heard another familiar sound from the other side of the room. Those heavy, slapping footsteps. Jesus Christ, there are two of them. I thought as terror pierced every muscle in my body as I lay limp on the floor. I heard the second set of footsteps grow closer. Slap, slap, slap. As I prepared to meet my fate where I'd no doubt be torn in half by two forest beasts, that's when the face-off happened. Both creatures began to growl at each other back and forth, as if locked in some sort of display of alpha male aggression. After several exchanges, they made their move. I heard the sound of flesh hitting flesh and bodies slamming up against the walls. I flicked my flashlight app back on and pointed it towards the noise as I looked from under the stall. The two creatures were locked in a life and death melee. They were growling inhumanly as they pushed each other back and forth, blood spilling onto the floor from what I imagined was them clawing and biting at each other in this life and death struggle. As their battle continued, one began to back away out of the entrance to the men's room, and the other followed in a frantic sprint. I still heard their inhuman growls as their battle continued outside until their voices trailed off into a barely audible drone in the woods. As terrified as I was, I got to my feet and exited the stall. I pointed the light from my phone against the floor. There was dark red blood and tufts of grayish-brown fur all over the floor. It looked like someone field-dressed an animal carcass in here. The stench was unbearable. It smelled like the inside of an animal cage at the zoo. What the hell were these things? I was not going to stick around and find out. I sprinted back to my car, entered, slammed the door shut, and peeled out of the parking lot like I was in a street race against death. My truck tires screeched as I careened out of the entrance and back onto the highway. I was covered in sweat and hyperventilating, having narrowly escaped a horrible death at the hands of some primal beasts from a forgotten era. I sped the rest of the way to my destination in New York. I arrived and checked into a hotel. I sat at the bar and downed several scotches before even dropping my bags in the room. My rattled nerves settled down eventually, and I made my way to my room. I lay on the bed sleepless, but sure of two things. I was not taking that route back home, and I was never stopping at a rest stop ever again. Second story. Goat Man in the Mountains. You see, I was young and my imagination was wild, but what I am about to tell you still terrifies me to these days. I went camping. The camp was located in the mountains. We went for 2 weeks, but hell these weeks would turn into. It was a night for telling stories, scary stories. Also, I was the only person sitting with my back to the fence. The fence was a barber fence, and the bushes were growing on the other side. We had animals, so we took care of them. So here we had deer, wolf, 2 horses, and few wild birds. So everyone was telling scary stories. We were 17 people around the fire, all girls and boys. Then my turn came to tell a story, and I decided to tell the story of the Goat Man. I started with telling the Anansi story. Everyone knows the story, so I don't think I need to write the whole story, but when I was telling them about the guys in the story being freaked out and hiding in the trailer, a goddamn branch snapped behind my back. Don't forget I was sitting with my back to the fence. Everyone bolted up and I almost jumped over the damn fire pit. One of the boys, Vlad, pointed his flashlight to the darkness of the woods, and we tried to see something, anything, for 5 minutes. We were staring, nothing. Have in mind that the flashlight was strong enough to see nearby. After 5 minutes, we decided to sit back, and I continued with the story, keeping on and reaching the part with the girls screaming in terror. I shit you not, right behind my back the sound of the bushes made my skin rise and goosebumps rustle. Rustle? Like someone or something was taunting us. The sound was like someone brushed their hand on this thick bush. Everyone jumped and Peter, a rather tall boy, screamed, "Stop it! It's not funny! Stop fucking with us!" He was scared despite being the tallest of us. The second thing that made me chilled to the bone, the animals went crazy. The deer was running in her cage. The wolf, which always was running in his big cage at night time, was now whimpering in his den. The horses were running further from the fence we were around. That was it. All of us started to freak out. By this point, the boys were scared more than the girls. I looked at them and said, "I am close to the end. I'll finish the story and we're out of here." One of the girls screamed into the darkness, "If this is our head, boys and head girls, please stop. It's not funny." Everyone heard someone coming from the cottages we were staying in. The guys were coming our way. Were our headman and head girls? We were terrified, looking at the fence and back to them. There's no way that they got so fast to the cottages without us noticing. They told us to cut the pranks off and put out the fire and go back to the dormitories. As I promised, I almost finished the story when we all smelled something like rotting eggs, disgusting and strong. Someone suggested that someone threw something in the fire pit or the animals' cages were not clean, but I knew damn well it was not it. The damn thing or animal decided to make the most uncommon noise behind my back. I jumped over the pit, and we all huddled in one place. As Vlad pointed his flashlight, we all froze like an animal freeze. We did. I still remember that moment in my life. From the darkness of the forest, reflected by the flashlight, were peering at us a pair of yellow eyes. The height for these eyes was not okay with me. We were staring at each other for good 10 minutes when it decided to bare its teeth and screech at us. We all bolted, forgetting about the damn fire. As I turned around, these damn eyes were peering at us and shinning in the damn darkness. Without the flashlight, we all run inside our dormitories, and the head boy of ours asked us, "What the hell is going on? Why you didn't put out the fire?" He was angry, but we didn't care. We refused to go back there again. When he came back after putting the fire out, he looked paler than usual and said for us to go and sleep. He locked the doors and windows, which we never did before. All of us couldn't sleep, hearing the strangest noises coming from the woods. Noises that were not like any animal we knew. This night, nor we, nor the animals were calm. The next morning, we went to look at the place where we had our stories. I shit you not, the bonfire was destroyed. The bushes, where I was sitting, were bent together with the fence, and then the most chill realization came over me. There was a hole in the fence, like someone tried to sneak in. It was torn like it was a piece of paper to this thing. Needless to say, I was shocked. I was shaking, and my friend came and said, "I don't think we all imagined that. But why did you decide to tell that story?" I was speechless. As we were passing our days, mostly all of us decide never to talk about it again. When I was about to leave, I saw our head boy near the fence peering into the woods. So I went to him. I called out to him, and he motioned to come closer, so I did. He said, "You know, that night when I came out to put out the fire, I smelled something disgusting, rotting. The moment I heard this noise near the fence, I saw something that scared me to death. There was a silhouette of something standing in the darkness, bending over the fence with two yellow glowing eyes, punching over the fire pit. I screamed and ran back to the cottages. When?" He paused and was shaking. When I looked back, it was gone. "I guess you didn't lie. Next morning, I saw a hole in the fence and the animals were jumpy. So I saw from the other side of the fence prints, but not ones of a boar, doe, elk, or some other animal. Those were cloven like goats." He looked at me with teary eyes. I felt regret telling that damned story. I didn't think that it will become such a terrifying reality. Just a myth, right? Just a story. Years pass and I still can't bring myself go alone camping or going to the mountain, only in big groups. So that's my story. I felt like it was a long time till I made myself write this here. So I hope people will learn never to mess around with him. Third story. My neighbors had an encounter with someone with black eyes. If I had any time in my life I had noticeable chills, it would be tonight. I was getting cozy into my bed when I heard a knock at my door. My wife tells me to answer it, and I reluctantly go to do so, having read about black-eyed kids recently. To my relief, it was only the neighbors whose kid plays with my two kids. They asked me, "Has anyone come by and knocked on your door tonight?" I told them no, and they told me what had happened. Apparently, a chubby woman with curly brown hair came to their door and asked if she could come in and use their phone because her car was broken down. The first thought that came to the one neighbor's mind was where the meth-head boyfriend of this woman could be, because her eyes showed zero indication of irises. She was fortunately put off because of this and told the lady that there was a gas station down the road and that would be the best place for help. Immediately after she closed the door, her wife checked out the window and the woman miraculously wasn't there anymore. Their driveway is pretty long. It takes a good few minutes to walk up or down, and there's hardly any foliage. They then took it upon themselves to warn the other neighbors in the general area, and the same question was asked to them. "Did you let her in?" I have no idea what this woman could have been, but the closest thing that came to mind was black-eyed children. She had the same MO, and from what they said, she didn't go to any of the other houses that would have made sense because their house was considerably further from the road than mine or the landlord's. Our house has trees, theirs not so much. This is just a friendly warning because my adrenaline is pumping and I'm seriously creeped out that this happened so close to my home just tonight so soon after hearing about them. Fourth story. I accidentally no-clipped to a mall from hell in a world that rained fire. The day this all started seemed as boring and mundane as any other. My wife, Sarah, and I were going to the movies to see a comedy that she was interested in and that I was not. We had driven across the city and parked in an overpriced parking lot, stepping over the sleeping forms of filthy homeless people and the used needles and cigarette butts that littered the sidewalks here. I was listening to Sarah talk about the recent rise of gutter oil and spit oil in China, both horrifying topics in their own right. As Sarah went on to explain to me, gutter oil was when restaurants in China scooped up the vegetable oil from the trash cans out back of the restaurant. They would use the filthy, carcinogen-ridden oil to cook food for new customers. Spit oil was when Chinese restaurants would just take the broth from bowls where customers had finished eating and reheat it. They would then pour the reused spit oil broth into new bowls with fresh pieces of meat and vegetables added and serve it to the next customer. This was broth that someone else, a total stranger, was just drooling into. "It's so disgusting," Sarah said over the din of contrast traffic as she brushed a lock of hair the color of chestnuts behind her ear. The crosswalk turned green and we started ahead with Sarah in the lead. It shows that China really is just a paper tiger, at least in terms of its economy. The people are so desperate there. I saw a blur of something pale behind us, something tall and spidery that slunk through the crowd. I quickly spun my head, but I only saw groups of people milling around. I wondered if I was hallucinating for a moment. "Are you listening to me?" Sarah said, and I saw she was looking at me now with a queer expression on her face. Her eyes always reminded me of emeralds, the way the green irises sparkled. I shook my head. "I thought I saw something," I murmured as we pushed our way through the crowd and into the movie theater. We waited in line and bought our tickets. Everything seemed normal enough. I kept thinking back to that glimpse I had of the pale creature skittering through the city with its thin, jointed legs. I had never seen anything like that before, not even in my nightmares. I shuddered. "This is our theater," Sarah said. I followed her, silent. I felt off balance, though little did I know that things were about to get much worse. I looked down at my arms, seeing goosebumps rise all over my skin. Everything felt freezing cold as we walked through the door into Black Hall, parallel to the stairs in the theater. The door closed behind me, but everything seemed wrong. There was no light coming from the front of the movie theater. No film was playing on the screen, if indeed there was a screen at all, because all I could see here was total blackness, as if we had walked into an abyss. I didn't hear the chattering of the crowd in the seats, either. In that endless void, only the breathing of myself and Sarah rang out along with my thudding heartbeat. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shattering the silence. I took out my cell phone and turned it on, shining it around. Sarah stood in front of me, but we weren't in the movie theater anymore. It looked like we were standing in some sort of empty warehouse with concrete floors disappearing into the distance all around us. Deep cracks spiderwebbed their way through the floor. The walls, too, were the same bare, gray concrete. They rose high into the air, and my phone's dim light couldn't penetrate deep enough to find any ceiling. The air here felt cold, and the wind constantly whipped through, as if we were standing on top of a mountain. Sarah took out her phone, too. Her eyes gleamed with panic. I turned, looking for the door we had just come through. It was there, and relief filled my heart. It looked different, cracked and ancient, the wood splintering down the middle in a jagged, lightning bolt pattern, but it was there. Did we go through the wrong door or something? Sarah whispered in a small, frightened voice. "I'm so confused right now. That was our theater, wasn't it?" I ignored her and ran forwards, flinging the ancient door open. On the other side, though, I didn't see the red carpeted hall for the movie theater or the cheesy posters lining its walls. No, it wasn't the wrong door, I whispered, horrified. Something's happened. Something bad. I don't know what it is, but my voice trailed off as, side by side, we stared out into the strange world waiting before us. We each took a step outside onto the surface of the alien planet. The nighttime sky swirled above us, blood-red and bursting with lightning that sizzled through the clouds. It whirled like a hurricane, meeting in a black eye that bubbled over with thick clouds of fiery smoke that blew across the landscape in suffocating torrents. The ground was covered in layers of fine, glossy sand that looked like obsidian. The building we stood in stretched far above our heads, appearing hundreds of stories tall. It was of a sheer, brutalist architecture composed of thick walls of cement with no windows. The top of it disappeared in the impenetrable mist of the bloody clouds. It had only one single door on this wall as far as I could see, a wall which stretched out for what looked like thousands of feet in each direction. It almost appeared like an optical illusion with the smooth, gray concrete disappearing off in the distance. It looked like a windowless gray warehouse in my mind, though perhaps in hindsight, it was really more of a prison. Throughout the massive chamber of the warehouse, there was a white glare that continuously cut out and turned back on every few seconds. Hanging down on cables hundreds of feet long stood thousands of flickering fluorescent lights. They strobed on and off with an incessant tinking, pinging sound. "So much for going back the way we came," I said, shaking my head grimly. "Am I dead right now? Are we in hell or something?" Sarah gave a short bark of sarcastic laughter that sounded far too loud in the eerie setting. It looked like some endless, empty warehouse built on an alien planet. "I've heard of stories like this," she whispered, her face pale and covered in sweat, her eyes wide and dilated. "Some people call it no clipping. I thought it was all a bunch of bullshit, but how else could you explain this? It's like we accidentally went through the wrong door into another world." "No clipping?" I asked. I would have laughed if I weren't petrified with terror. "That's from some 90s video games. I think Doom and Duke Nukem." It's just a cheat code that allows you to walk through walls. It's just what people call it, she repeated, shaking her head. I didn't make it up. I think it's more likely someone drugged us or something, I said. Or probably just me. I bet you're not even real. Maybe I'm just talking to myself, drooling on the floor somewhere with a dart of bromo dragonfly sticking out of my back. Sarah looked out onto the alien landscape and the black volcanic sands that stretched off as far as the eye could see. The swirling of the clouds in the sky seemed to grow faster. They threw off rusty streaks of bloody light that flashed in regular intervals and lit up the world with a blinding crimson radiance. At first, I thought it had started to rain outside. I saw drops of what looked like luminescent, orange-red hail falling from the sky and raining down on the black sands below. But as it rapidly grew closer with a roaring like a tornado, I realized the sky was raining drops of liquid magma. They sizzled and popped as they fell through the air in a fiery blur. The earth greedily sucked the molten lava into its dark skin. A smell like matches and campfire smoke filled the area as clouds of choking black smoke rose high into the air. "No, it's real!" Sarah exclaimed in a horrified voice as she quickly backpedaled away from the door and the approaching showers of lava. "It's coming towards us. Close the door. Close it, close it." But my body felt sluggish and far away. Nothing seemed to be reacting like it should. I could only stare at the flames as they filled the world with their sizzling radiance, 50 feet away, then 30, then 10. Sarah grabbed my shoulder, snapping me out of reverie. I stumbled back inside the warehouse and slammed the ancient-looking door closed behind me. The roar of the fire continued outside, smashing against the roof high above our heads with a sound like a hurricane. I tried to scream, but I couldn't hear my own voice over the ear-splitting cacophony. The fluorescent lights high above us with their cords like endless snakes stopped their flickering at that moment, shutting off abruptly and plunging us into total darkness. The sound of a siren started from all around us, ringing out from the walls and floor of the giant concrete structure itself. It reminded me of a tornado siren, rising and falling in an eerie, ghostly moan as if the spirits of the dead were themselves wailing in agony. We took out our cell phones, shining the lights out in front of us. The bouncing shadows went skittering out across the smooth concrete floor. We stood there, huddled together and terrified. "You know what this reminds me of?" I whispered. The firestorm had passed overhead, and though the reverberations of the molten drops hitting the roof still echoed across the endless chamber, the sound had grown faded and distant as the storm continued off into the distance. I heard a case in Hungary where a school bus full of kids were traveling in the absolute middle of nowhere. Apparently, the few people who lived in the area saw a bright light in the sky and heard an explosion. Later on, someone found the school bus, but all the kids and the bus driver had disappeared, except for 2 twin girls. But you know what the strangest part is? Both of the girls claimed they didn't have any siblings, that they had no twins, and that they had no idea who the other person was. Sarah covered her face with her hands. "That doesn't help us at all," she said, shaking her head. "What if this kind of stuff happens all the time, though?" I continued. "What if those kids ended up in a place like this? What if they just fell through a doorway into another reality or were taken? So who was the real twin?" "I don't get it," she said. "I don't know. Maybe neither of them. I think you're missing the point here. Maybe there's other people here. Maybe there's another way back to the regular world. If there's a doorway here, then there must be another doorway that leads back somewhere, right? Maybe there's hundreds of doorways that lead into this place. Maybe there's millions," I said. Sarah opened her mouth to say something when the siren started again, followed by a deep man's voice. He spoke like a radio broadcaster announcing a terrorist attack, using a grim, emotionless tone. Alert! The dead things are crawling. Alert! Level 5 firestorm in progress. Alert! The dead things are crawling. Alert! Level 5 firestorm is approaching in your direction. Please seek cover immediately. Remain in hiding until the danger has passed. Alert! The dead are rising. Alert! The dead are rising. Please take shelter immediately, the voice repeated. The siren wail rang out for a couple seconds, and then the message started repeating again. It sounded like there were speakers built into the walls and floor of the structure all around us, but I saw no vents, no boxes or wires. The lights far overhead flickered in time with the booming alert. After about 30 seconds, the voice abruptly cut out in the middle of its sentence. Emergency alert. The dead are rising. Emergency all. It droned on before the alert and the lights both cut out at the same time. There was a whining sound as if countless hidden fans were slowly whirring to a stop. I looked over at Sarah with a panicked expression, but as I opened my mouth to say something, the booming voice gave one last deep, drawn-out warning. Look behind you! It hissed as it deepened into something inhuman, something demonic and brimming with evil. My heart felt like a block of ice as I spun on my heels, raising my phone's light in front of me like a shield. Sarah's face had gone pale, and she wavered on her feet, looking as if she might pass out. The darkness pressed in on all sides, but the voice had been right. We weren't alone anymore. Something that looked like an old woman stood there only a few feet away, but everything about her looked wrong. She had a face as white as burning desert sands. Wrapped around her body, she wore a moth-eaten funeral shawl that looked as black as death. Her pale, nude body had bloody steel bars forced through her arms and chest. The steel rebar had been bent and twisted around her torso, ending in points sharp enough to skewer a human heart. The blood-stained bars formed a cage-like covering over her mutilated, bone-white flesh. Around these deep wounds, the skin hung, ragged and loose. Pieces of sharp steel jutted out from the ends of her fingers, ripping their way out of the flesh like talons. She grinned, and even her teeth were wicked points of glinting metal. She opened her mouth. Black, clotted blood gurgled and spun within. Her jaw unhinged, showing that her tongue had been cut out. The bloody, infected stump squirmed with maggots. Her filmy eyes seemed to look through us as she stood there, as motionless as a statue. Neither Sarah nor I moved for a long moment. I came to life then, stumbling back and away from this otherworldly abomination. As soon as I moved a single step, her neck snapped up with a cracking of bone. Her head ratcheted towards me. With twisting, jerking movements, she started towards me. Run! I screamed, tearing off without looking back to see if Sarah would follow. The smell from the old woman was wretched, like the stench of putrefying meat and formaldehyde. I headed straight into the heart of the massive building, hoping that it wasn't all just empty, bare concrete. I heard the thudding of feet behind me. Glancing back, I saw Sarah only a few feet behind me. The corpse of the old woman was close behind her, only a couple paces away. Her slashed legs skittered forward, leaving a trail of writhing maggots and drops of black blood in her wake. As we sprinted forward into the center of the warehouse, it seemed to open up around us like an abyss. The only wall fell further and further behind, but up ahead, there was a crimson glow in the great pool of shadows, something that shone like an emergency light. I pushed myself to the limit, but I knew I couldn't keep up this pace much longer. Sarah and I neared the bloody glow with the pale corpse of the old woman still close behind us. I could hear the gnashing of her metal teeth and her congested breathing, smell the stink of rot and death that emanated from her like a cloud. I realized that the red light was actually an elevator, stuck in the center of this immense abyss. Its shaft soared straight up into the air, disappearing from view in the darkness. The metal doors stood open, as if the elevator were waiting for us. I wondered where it led. A sudden scream erupted from behind me. I turned, seeing Sarah on the ground, the undead corpse writhing on top of her. Her metal teeth snapped together with a sharp ringing sound. Sarah had her arm up and was pushing with all her strength against the old woman's neck. But the old woman snapped and bit at the air, and with every bite, it seemed her face lowered another fraction of an inch closer to Sarah's eyes, her nose, her lips. Sarah would be ripped to shreds, her flesh sliced to pieces as if by a wood chipper. I saw the sharp points of metal poking from the corpse's torso, biting into Sarah's skin. Thin rivulets of blood soaked into her clothes. I ran forwards in a blind fury, my vision turning white with adrenaline as I brought my boot up into the old woman's chalk-white face. Her head snapped back, the neck cracking like a tree branch. Her head ratcheted up to face me, her pale cataract eyes gleaming with a rabid hunger. I backpedaled as she lunged forward, leaping through the air like a cat. Sarah lay on the ground, moaning and bleeding, temporarily forgotten by the abomination. I reached into my pocket, frantically looking for anything to defend myself with. I only felt my car keys. I brought the fob out with its point of steel. At that moment, she tackled me to the ground. A piece of steel stabbed into my left shoulder as I was forced down. She wrapped her sharp claws around my throat, choking me. The point slashed into my neck, leaving deep gouges that burned like fire. It felt like thousands of needles stabbed their way into my throat as I tried to scream. I held the fob like a knife in my right hand, clenched tightly in my fist. I brought my knee up and smashed it into her with a sudden rush of adrenaline, feeling her cold steel talons release my throat. A moment later, the undead woman's head snapped forward, biting deeply into my neck. I screamed as I struggled, writhing under her weight. I managed to free my right arm and brought the sharp point of the key straight up into her filmy eye. She gave a wail as she twitched, shaking her head from side to side. The key stayed firmly implanted. As cold, thick blood dripped from her exploded eye onto my face, I reached up and smashed the end of the fob with my palm, forcing the end deeper into her skull. I felt her weight lift off me suddenly. Sarah stood next to her, pushing at the exposed ribs of her putrefying torso, shoving her to the side. The sharp end of the key remained stuck in her rotted skull. The old woman went sprawling. Sarah reached down and helped pull me up off the ground. As the undead creature's banshee shriek reverberated all around us, we sprinted into the elevator. The undead woman leaked blood and gore all over the concrete in the bloody glow of the elevator's lights as she crawled forward on all fours in our direction. Sarah frantically began slamming the buttons on the elevator. As the undead woman came within inches of the threshold, the metal doors finally slid shut with a faint whirring. I released a long breath I didn't even realize I was holding. Covered in blood, both my own and the old woman's, I leaned heavily against the glass wall. The elevator began ascending up the shaft at a rapid pace. My stomach filled with butterflies as we rose. "Are you okay?" I asked breathlessly as we stared out the glass panes. Sarah was grabbing her stomach. I saw trickles of blood staining her white shirt and crimson blotches. I kept one hand on my neck, trying to stem the bleeding. I felt trickles of warm blood running through my fingers. "Nothing fatal," she whispered, though she was clearly in pain. So was I. I groaned, grabbing my head. Sarah was crying, her tears dripping down her face like drops of wax. Still stumbling, I went over and hugged her. She put her head against my shoulder, sobbing. "We're going to die here, aren't we?" "No, no, absolutely not," I said, not believing a word of it. "The worst is behind us." After rising thousands of feet into the air, the elevator's whirring gears began to slow. Above us, another level of the warehouse opened up. The shaft of the elevator rose through the center of a steel ceiling. We passed through and into something strange. "It looks like a mall," Sarah said as the elevator doors opened. In front of us stood a dimly lit hallway lined with dark stores on both sides. On the top, in ancient, rusted letters, I read, "The Badlands Mall." I didn't recognize the names of any of the stores, and there were some odd ones. I saw a shop that said Dahmer's Fresh Meats, with naked, butchered bodies strung up in the display windows, their arms, legs, and heads all cut off, their skin removed to show the glistening muscle underneath. Maggots had long ago infested the putrefying meat. Next to it was a giant department store with the bubbly name of Perillo's engraved above the entrance. But this was no ordinary department store. Instead of mannequins showing off clothes, the entire department store was filled with torture tools. Iron maidens and roaring bulls were set up out front. Many of the tools looked used, soiled with strips of flesh and pieces of rotting gore. Flies buzzed all around them, and a fetid smell like the bowels of hell wafted out of the department store in our direction. Perillo's had mannequins in many of the soiled torture tools, naked, pale mannequins covered in gore and blood. The fluorescent lights running overhead had power here, though they were dim. They flickered constantly, sending dancing shadows skittering across the mall. "I think we're in some kind of mall from hell," I whispered, wincing as even that echoed across the marble and off the glass panes of the stores. "Come on, let's go." "Why?" Sarah asked, a deep sense of terror reflected in her eyes. "I don't want to go out there. Let's just wait here in the elevator and—" "Wait for what?" I said, scoffing. "Rescue? You think anyone knows we're here? We don't even know where the hell we are. We need to keep moving forward. There must be some connection back to the real world. There must be." I didn't know if I was trying to convince myself or her. Sarah shook her head. I could see she was sweating heavily, her hands trembling. "I don't want to," she said in a voice like a little girl. I took her hand and pulled her forward. We limped out of there together. "We have to," I insisted. "Keep an eye out for any sort of useful weapons. That bitch took my only fob for my car. It's probably still stuck in her eyeball." "We could go check in there," Sarah said, motioning to Perillo's department store with its grisly array of torture devices. I shook my head quickly. "No, not there," I responded, casting a disgusted look at the patches of rotting skin still sticking to the open iron maidens, the burnt, melted fat leaking out of the roaring bulls. "I'm not sure we're alone up here, and I have a bad feeling about that place." Every time I glimpsed one of the faceless mannequins out of the corner of my eye, it made my heart leap in my chest, thinking it was a person. The mannequins were crucified, impaled, or nailed to the ceilings and walls in front of Perillo's. It looked like hundreds of them filled the store. Even stranger, they all appeared to have blood crusted on their naked, plastic bodies. And it was a lot of blood. A shiver ran down my spine as we hurried away without looking back. The stores and shops lining both sides of the dark, flickering hallway got stranger and stranger. There was a rundown ice cream shop called Brownies. On the dust-covered menu, they advertised ice cream in many flavors, including bloody pus-flavored, maggot-flavored, and tombstone-flavored ice cream. Through the clear plexiglass, I saw rancid buckets of foul-smelling sludge that might once have been ice cream. I was staring at two broken-down vending machines. One had drinks and advertised Springy's lemon lime soda, Connor brand cola, and St. Christoph's ginger ale. The other had strange foods, including Overhalser's beef jerky, chocolate bars with caramel and peanuts called Eyes and Hearts, Took's saltwater taffy, and Reese's fruit snacks. "This is truly bizarre," Sarah whispered, looking around furtively. "It's like we've wandered into a parallel Earth with its own brands and stores. But where are all the people?" As if in answer to her question, we heard something dragging behind us. There was a low whispering of many voices, though they formed no words. It created a low susurration more reminiscent of a den of hissing snakes. With horror, I glanced behind me and saw the mannequins from the store crawling down the hall towards us. Their smooth, faceless heads ratcheted up as if they had gears in their necks. With jerky movements, they twisted forward, their flat palms smacking the marble floor. Drops of thick, old blood dripped from their plastic bodies. They had no mouths, but I could hear the low gurgling of their strange voices all the same. Hundreds of these pale forms slithered through the halls. I took off running. A second later, I heard Sarah's thudding footsteps close behind me. We passed by dozens of eerie, dark stores. In the glass displays of many, naked mannequins covered in gore came to life as we passed, their heads twisting to follow us, their arms and legs shivering with newfound energy. At the end of the hallway, I saw a familiar sign above a massive department store. It said Sears. The doors opened up into a dark, mildewed chamber filled with rusted metal shelving and debris. Without any better ideas, I turned to scream at Sarah, pointing at the store. "It's a goddamn Sears. We need to get to it." Her face had turned chalk white, her eyes wide with terror. I realized the skittering mannequins were only feet behind her. As a gurgle hissed from its mouthless face, one of the mannequins reached forward and grabbed Sarah's ankle. She fell forward, smashing her head hard against the marble floor. I heard the bone give a crack as a blossom of blood exploded from her forehead. Moaning, she tried to crawl away as the mannequins swarmed her, ripping her skin off with their sharp plastic fingers. I glimpsed this horror only for a moment. It was the last image I would ever have of my wife, the woman I loved. With the last of my fading strength, I pushed myself forward. Sarah's dying screams followed me into the Sears. I heard more of the tapping limbs of the mannequins close behind me, but I dared not look back. As I ran through the smashed glass doors leading into the abandoned department store, Sarah's screams abruptly cut off. For a few moments, I thought I still heard the hissing whispers of the mannequins, but then that, too, went silent. I wandered through the dilapidated Sears under waterlogged ceilings and over thick layers of dust. Eventually, I found the front of the store and smashed my way out of the door. I was in the middle of a parking lot for a mall that looked like it had been abandoned since the 1990s. I saw a highway stretching out nearby, filled with headlights streaming in both directions. I wandered out of the abandoned mall parking lot and down a winding ramp until I found myself on some sort of bridge. Injured and exhausted, I pushed myself forward with the last of my energy. After a few more minutes, I finally came to a house. Frantically, I knocked on the door and asked for help. They called the police, who were totally baffled by everything I tried to tell them. Apparently, my wife and I had been missing for over 2 weeks, even though less than a day had passed for us. Even stranger, however, I ended up thousands of miles away from where I started, seemingly teleported there from the procession of strange doors of the Badlands. My wife and I had started our trip over in Boston, and by the time I staggered out, bloody and terrified, I found myself in an abandoned mall near San Jose, California. Now, I always check every room before I enter it. That hellish place took my wife from me and gave me enough nightmares to last an entire lifetime. I never want to see that abandoned mall of horrors or that swirling, blood-red sky again. Fifth story. I know where black-eyed children come from. When I was a kid, my little brother and I visited my grandparents in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, every summer. It was a pretty boring town. As the capital of the Cherokee Nation, most recreational activities were related to the culture and history of the Cherokees. The last summer we spent there I was 11, that age between wanting so badly to be seen as a teenager, but still finding enjoyment in Bratz dolls. My brother was 8 and wouldn't settle down, unless he had his Nintendo DS. I didn't dread visiting my grandparents, like many children do, other than the cultural shock that came from leaving our home in LA to the relatively small Oklahoma town. I loved spending time with my grandparents, and so did my brother. They spoiled us with toys and ice cream. On a Thursday afternoon, my little brother and I were playing at the elementary school across the street from my grandparents' house. If you've ever been to Oklahoma, you probably know how quickly the weather can change. It's not uncommon for it to snow one day and be in the 70s the next day. This day went from sunny to cloudy, extremely quick. It didn't begin raining or lightning, so my brother and I continued to play. But these weren't normal clouds. They looked heavier and thicker. They were almost black. I'm still not sure if the clouds were some sort warning for what was about to happen, or I'm just trying to connect things. A girl who was probably 9 or 10 showed up at some point. She didn't have parents with her, but it was a fairly safe town and not uncommon for kids to walk around. She introduced herself as Ally. She was blonde and blue-eyed, but began enlightening us with old Cherokee ghost tales. With Tahlequah being the capital of the Cherokee Nation, many urban legends and other towns are actually true in Tahlequah. Most people's great-great-grandmas really were Cherokees, and the school playground we were currently playing on really had once been an Indian burial ground. She told us one particular grotesque story about the Deer Lady, who was a hair-broken woman that went insane and cut her legs off and stitched a deer's legs on her torso in place. Her final story inspired what we thought would be a fun adventure. She told us a chief's 15-year-old daughter had been brutally murdered by her white husband on their anniversary for flirting with another man. They buried her and, out of respect, never removed her gravestone when the school was built. Ally told us it would take a bit of maneuvering, but there was a panel that could be removed and we could crawl underneath the school and see the gravestone. We were all in shape, so we began our adventure. To our disappointment, the panel had been screwed shut and it began to rain. My brother and I decided to go home. Ally, however, insisted that there had to be another way in. I tried to tell her that her parents would probably be worried and that it would be best for her to go home too, but she was determined to find a way in. My brother and I went into my grandparents' house and changed into some dry clothes, drank Kool-Aid, and watched TV. While my brother and grandparents were watching The Fairly Odd Parents, I noticed I could still see Ally, drenched in rain, trying to find a way underneath the school from the living room window. Eventually, she did. I watched her crawl in, but I never saw her crawl out. We sat through an entire episode of The Fairly Odd Parents and half an episode Drake and Josh, so it had to have been 45 minutes. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I told myself she had to have come out a different way, or maybe she came out when I wasn't looking and finally drifted off. The next morning I woke up refreshed. I was certain Ally had found a way out. My grandparents took us to the carnival and to Brahms, the local ice cream shop. It was 6 o'clock in the evening when we got home and my grandma began cooking supper, while my grandpa took a nap. My brother and I were kids though, and still had lots of energy left. So, we went across the street to play some more and our grandma told she would call us when supper was ready. I told my little brother that I had seen Ally go underneath the school and asked him if he was up for an adventure. He agreed and I went to the panel that I saw Ally loosen. I loosened and crawled underneath the school and my brother followed. The reaming daylight flooded into the basement along with us, providing us with just enough light to see things directly in front of us. The ground was cold, wet dirt, and there were many pipes and old basketballs to crawl around. I immediately spotted 8 to 10 headstones, though. The first one was directly to the right of my brother and I, but the name was too faded to read. I was feeling kind of creeped out that Ally had been right, and we were crawling over a bunch of dead bodies. I probably would have left, but my brother didn't seem afraid at all, and I wanted to seem braver than him. So I crawled to the next stone. This one read, Andrew Cummings, and had a birth date of 1890 and death date of 1902. There was one to the left of it that read, Allison Cummings, and had a birth date of 1893 and death date of 1902. Also, this freaked me out even more and made me think of Ally, who had the same name and looked about the same age as the dead girl several feet below me. My brother suddenly shouted, Look! Something in the corner just moved. Before I could tell him that we should leave immediately, he shoved me out of the way and began crawling incredibly fast to the corner furthest from us. I could clearly see a couple of large figures moving, but couldn't make out much else. They're probably just dogs, let's go, I told him, but as he crawled, I crawled right behind him, getting closer and closer to the larger figures that began to look more and more like silhouettes of 3 people sitting against a wall, all with their knees to their chest. When they came into clear view, my brother turned around and crawled underneath me. I held him close to my chest. We were bothered terrified. The first girl was clearly Ally, except she didn't look as lively as she had looked yesterday. She wasn't smiling and her hair was stringy. Next to her was a boy, who looked close in age to me and had no hair at all. He wasn't smiling either. Then there was a girl who looked more normal than Ally or the boy. Her skin was dark and her hair was so long it bunched up at the ground. She looked like she was about 16, but her facial expression was the scariest. It was one of absolute despair. The scariest part about all of them, those, was their eyes. I could see my brother's eyes glowing, but none of their eyes glowed. It didn't even really look like they had eyes, just pits of darkness. Ally smiled and said, Thank God, you guys came. The other 2 laughed. Yeah, well, we're going to be leaving now, I said, trying my hardest to sound casual and not scared. All 3 laughed and the other girl spoke up, No, you're not. Her voice had a confidence that mine didn't. I pushed my brother in the direction we came in, and he began quickly crawling away. I heard my grandma calling out to us and called out to her to help us. All 3 of them suddenly stopped laughing. Ally suddenly looked scared. She said, Leave right now and never tell a soul. You saw us? You got lucky. We didn't have to be told twice and quickly crawled out. At dinner that night, my brother and I chalked up our silence to it having been a long day and us being tired. We never played at the playground across the street again and rarely talked about the incident. 5 months after we left, my grandparents were murdered in their own home. A neighbor had said she had seen my grandma let 3 children into their home the day of their murder. A bald boy, a blonde girl, and a dark-haired girl. Cops were never able to find any leads, and the case was eventually closed. Neither my brother nor I plan to visit Tahlequah or even Oklahoma ever again, but I know that it doesn't matter. I'm certain that one day they'll show up on my step too. I know I'll tell them to go away, and I can only hope that will be enough.